Tudors came to England and changed everything. Don't you just hate change? Absolutely. Once you get to be over 40, it's an abomination. Well, of course, the Tudors didn't spring onto the picture just an act of God. They arrived in the 1480s as a result of a civil war, the War of the Roses. You've all heard about that. The Lancastrians and the Yorkists were fighting over who should be king. They were all descended from the same man, but it was a struggle. It lasted for about 30 years, absolutely depleted England. And finally, when one slew the other, Henry Tudor was the scion of the Lancastrian line, so he was considered the candidate who was the victor. And Parliament said, oh, for God's sake, enough of this. Let's crown him king and have it done with. So they did, and he became Henry VII of England. Naturally, after a civil war, there are always little uprisings of the people that were overcome, and they don't want to be overcome. They want to keep at it. So he was confronted with lots of little rebellions, which he crushed with great ferocity, young as he was. And in 1487, that's a couple of years after the war stopped, he instituted the infamous Star Chamber. This is the way you get rid of your political enemies. This was established. It was a secret chamber. Literally, it was a room with stars painted on the ceiling. That's why they called it that. The judges sat at a table in the dark. You didn't have your lawyer. You couldn't bring anybody in to testify for you. You didn't know what the charges were. You were either guilty or not. And you had to plead. And of course, to help you plead guilty, which was the object of it, torture was employed. And we still use this process today where we have our, well, no, you do. You have your military court, which is, aren't you reading the newspapers? Yeah, well, we use this process today. It's not quite with hot irons and that sort of thing, but the end is the same. And this was effective, and it was used all down through history, to, as I say, to the present. One of the resolutions of the Civil War was that the two families that were fighting would intermarry after the war, which they did, and he married Elizabeth of York, the opposition party daughter, and she bore him 3 children. Unfortunately, Queen Elizabeth, the consort, died early after the 3 children were born. The oldest of their sons was Arthur. Henry now decided that it would be a good plan to marry his son to the Spanish crown. Spain was the biggest thing going. This was negotiated after a long debate with Isabella and Ferdinand. A huge dowry was agreed upon, and they sent their youngest daughter, Catherine, to marry Arthur. And they were married. And Henry was pleased, counting the dowry. But a year later, Arthur died, bollocksing the whole thing. So Isabella said, bring back the dowry. Also, you can send Catherine too, but the dowry. Henry wasn't about to send the dowry back. In fact, he offered to marry Catherine himself. Isabella hit the fan because she said that, my God, he's old enough to be her father. So that didn't work out, and they were still negotiating on this issue. It wasn't a done deal. Isabella died in the meantime. Ferdinand took up the lawsuit after that, and he and Henry had years and years it was in dispute. Henry VII was an astute man. He was merciless and ruthless in suppressing rebellions, but he was considered to be a peacemaker or a peacekeeper, if not maker, and so England was not at war during his reign. He died in 1509. Well, that brought the second son. There was Arthur, Henry, and Margaret. And Henry, the second son, was now in line for the throne. And so, of course, he was elevated to be Henry VIII. He was a youngster then. I think he was 19 or 20. Very handsome and, blooming youth and all that business. And he settled the marriage issue right away. He immediately, well, it took a dispensation from Pope Julius II, but he immediately married his former sister-in-law. And that was that. The dowry stayed, and so did Catherine after being passed around this way. She was older, of course, than Henry as a result. By the 15 teens, news was coming from abroad, from the German states in Europe, about the Lutheran heresy. Martin Luther had been busy doing his thing and the other reformers. And so this came to England. Well, remember, we were all devout Catholics, including Martin Luther. And Henry was the most devout of devout, and he was an excellent theological student. He denounced the Lutheran heresy. And he did so publicly and in print. And he told the Pope of his undying devotion to the Mother Church, etc., etc. Well, Leo X, who was Pope at that time, thought that was pretty grand. So he sent Henry the Golden Rose, which is a great honor from the papacy still today. And he declared that Henry VIII was defender of the faith. And as we said last month, the kings and monarchs of England have been defenders of the faith ever since. As we will see, the faith began to change. The major influence in Henry VIII's life in this first almost 20 years of his reign was Thomas Cardinal Wolsey. Now, Wolsey came from modest origins, to be sure, but he entered the church early in life and rose steadily in the English Catholic Church. He served under Henry VII. He was tutor and guide to young Prince Henry and now Henry VIII. He was made cardinal by Henry VIII and then chancellor. That made him, we didn't have prime ministers then, but it would be like that. So he was enormously powerful. He enjoyed his power and he used it liberally, made many enemies, especially among the noblemen. The noblemen thought he was a man of common origins. You know, how could he tell us what to do? Well, by God, Wolsey told him what to do, and if they didn't do it, the king had him executed. So it was not a happy time for some people as far as Wolsey's policies were concerned. But Wolsey had a grand dream for Henry. He wanted to make England and Henry and himself great. The two biggest powers in Europe at that time were France and Spain. Spain really was the biggest, but France was coming up. And at the same time, I'm talking about the candidacy for the Holy Roman Empire, the crown for the Holy Roman Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was coming up. Maximilian of Austria was dying. And there would be three candidates for this position. One was Francis I of France. Another was Charles of Spain. And the third was Henry. Now, Wolsey pushed this candidacy. It was his idea. He wanted to make Henry Holy Roman Emperor and himself Pope, modestly. And he was playing France and Spain against each other. Now, England had allied herself in Henry VII's time to Spain, remember? That was a good alliance, strong. But now, Wolsey began to negotiate with Francis of France and designed a summit meeting of Henry and Francis. They didn't have summit meetings then. It would take place in Calais. Calais was the last foothold of England in Europe. It's French today, as you know. So they staged a great event, and it was called the Field of the Cloth of Gold. It went on for weeks. Everybody who was anybody arrived, set up a gorgeous tent. There were tournaments, banquets, parades, fireworks, all kinds of things going on for weeks. And of course, there were Francis and Henry, the two major personalities. They were very similar in age and body weight. Francis was short, but he was stocky and strong. And Henry was tall, but quite muscular. And they both fancied themselves as wrestlers. So nothing would do, but they have a wrestling match. But it would not do if one thoroughly conquered the other. So the first day, Henry threw Francis, and the second day, Francis threw Henry. And everybody was happy. And the whole thing went off with a great éclat. Unfortunately, meddling in world affairs the way Wolsey had done was not too helpful. Henry was passed over for the imperial title, and Charles of Spain received it. So Charles was now the Holy Roman Emperor. Wolsey continued to play off France and Spain against each other in the hopes that this would benefit England. It didn't really. Well, by the end of the 1520s, Henry, who had been married now for almost 20 years to Catherine, and she had borne him a daughter. They had other children had been born, but they died in infancy. And he wanted a son. And by this time, he was in a froth over the issue. He wanted a son. And to make it even better, he was going after a younger woman. Have you ever heard that story? He was involved with one of the Boleyn daughters. The Boleyn family were prominent at court, in court business administration. There was Mary and Anne, or Nan, as she was called then. And he'd been noodling Mary, and Anne had been abroad getting a French education in her early life, teens. When she came back as a woman, she caught his eye. And he was absolutely obsessed with Nan Boleyn. She was very tiny, bird-like in physique. She had beautiful long black hair. She wasn't conventionally pretty, but she was magnetic. She absolutely captured his, well, you know what, his testosterone elements. And she said, no, I'm not going to sleep with you unless you make me queen. And she kept this thing going for 7 years. Can you imagine? No, 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 make me queen. No, 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 put it all away. No, you know. He was in an absolute state of fit to be tied, as you say. He wanted out of this marriage with Catherine, and he told Wolsey to get him out of it. He wanted the marriage annulled. Well, Wolsey was aghast. This was terrible. They needed the Spanish alliance. This would ruin everything. Tried to argue the king out. Nope, nothing would do. You have to go to Rome and get the Pope to annul the marriage. Well, Wolsey went to Rome. And what did he find? Oh my God, the worst timing imaginable. Pope Clement VII was the reigning pope. He had been in an argument with the Emperor Charles V. Charles had sent his army into Rome and captured the Pope, and he was held in confinement in the Castle Sant'Angelo. And this is when Wolsey arrived to plead the case for Henry. Well, Clement was in a terrible spot. Not only was the captive of Charles, but now Wolsey wanted Henry's wife, who happened to be Charles's aunt. Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Charles was the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella. And of course, here was Clement. If he decided for Henry, of course, Charles would throttle him. And if he decided with Charles, of course, he'd never work with Henry again. But he said, we'll set up a commission. And they did. They sent Cardinal Campeggio with Wolsey back to London to hear the case of Henry's annulment. And it was heard in public. Catherine, poor soul, had to come in and testify. Catherine of Aragon was one of the most popular queen consorts of the period. She was generous. She was a great philanthropist. She was a dutiful wife. All of this was brought out at this hearing. And Campeggio said, well, she's been a dutiful wife for 20 years. She's borne children. She's done everything a wife should do. I'm not going to offer any annulment to the Pope. This is ridiculous. There's not going to be any divorce here. And went back to Rome. Well, Henry was absolutely going crazy. Here was Anne in the wings, you know, doing whatever women do to get men excited. I wouldn't know. Of course, Wolsey was there totally at a loss. He had failed. And Henry did what Henry was typical of doing. Some men do this always. He unloaded all his own stupidity on somebody else and made them to blame. You're to blame for all of this, Wolsey. You got me into it. It's your fault. Absolutely without foundation. But then Wolsey's enemies, they all knew about this. They went to Henry and said, yes, Wolsey is a traitor. He has been doing things. Whispered in Henry's ear, and Henry then ordered Wolsey taken out of his great positions. He had the highest position in the land. He had great wealth, traveled in great state, and all of it was taken away from him. All of it stripped down to nothing. He was the Archbishop of York. He was ordered back to his see at York, house arrest virtually. There he stayed for about a year. And then Henry, to cap off his villainy, sent Wolsey's worst enemies, some of these nobles that had always hated him, out to York to drag him back to London for God knows what reason. Well, on the way, he had had a stroke, Wolsey had, a minor one, and he was ill, and of course he was in a state of terrible depression, and he died en route. He said before his death, if I had served God as faithfully I've served the king, mine enemies would not now be able to cast me out. Well, they cast him out all right. Well, Henry now turned his rage on the papacy itself. He had been an opponent of Lutheranism, Henry had. Thomas Cromwell stepped into Wolsey's shoes. Cromwell had been Wolsey's secretary, so he knew all the ins and outs. And Cromwell said, well, you know, this might be a good idea. Forget your opposition to Luther. Let's let his message come into England. We'll form up a support in England and join with the European resistance to the papacy. And Henry said, all right, anything, come on, let's get with it. So Henry began to revise his own position, you know, a complete turnaround, and allowed the Protestant propaganda to start flooding into England. He fostered the Lutheran message, totally reversed, you see. There was a rapid development of an anti-clerical party. Now, it's not anti-Catholic. People don't understand these things. Everybody was devout Catholic, whether they were opposing the Pope or not. And anti-clericism simply means you're opposed to the bishops, the priests, the monsignors, the cardinals, and the princes of the church. That was where you're opposing. Well, the king began to work to persuade churchmen to change their view in England about the subject and break with Rome. All they were doing was rejecting the papacy at this point. Well, a couple of years later, Parliament accepted the king's urging that he, the king, be made head of the church in England. There's no Church of England. It's the church in England at this time. The Roman Catholic Church without the Pope in England. Well, as soon as that was a fait accompli, Henry said, I'm the head of the church, I annul my own marriage. And Catherine was put under house arrest. Her daughter Mary was declared illegitimate. And then he immediately married Nan Boleyn. As soon as Catherine was on the way out, and materially so, under house arrest and the rest of it, these things took months, it didn't happen overnight, Nan Boleyn said, all right, I'll sleep with you. And by the time they married, a few months later, she was pregnant. And the next day, virtually, the Pope excommunicated him, Henry. Well, everything depended now on Anne producing. She had said during the courtship all these years, I'll give you a platoon of sons, you just make me queen, and I'll show you what sons look like. So Henry was waiting now, all right, let's see the son. Now, fidget, fidget, fidget. So she had to produce a son. And besides, as she got pregnanter and pregnanter, is that grammar? His eye began to wander. And he fetched up on Jane Seymour, one of the Seymour girls. The Seymour sisters were Queen Anne's ladies-in-waiting. And found Jane Seymour very attractive. And he began to carry her around the garden on his arm. And of course, his pregnant wife could see out the window what was going on. Of course, the urgency to produce a son got worse. Well, the end of that year, 33, Anne bore her child, a daughter. Henry named the child Elizabeth after his mother, but now he wanted out of this marriage. Well, Anne had all she could do to extract Henry from his attention on Jane Seymour and get him back into her bed. And I think a little liquid refreshment must have helped. Finally, she was able to get him to sleep with her again. Took her nearly a year and a half. And he made her pregnant a second time. Everything depended on this second pregnancy. She now had, her family were all hoovering over her, you've got to have a son. You know, all their jobs depended on it. And Henry was glaring at her when he wasn't courting Jane Seymour. It was just, the pressure was horrible. And at the end of 1535, she gave birth prematurely to a son, dead. Well, now Henry was raving. He told Cromwell, get us out of this damn thing or your head is going to go. Well, Cromwell couldn't think of any way to get him out. They had all these business to get her married. Now he wanted out. And somebody suggested, well, you know, there's a law here that says if a queen consort commits adultery, it's a death penalty offense. Ha ha! So they all devoted on that. A phony case against Queen Anne was trumped up, accusing her of adultery and incest. She and her brother were very close. There was no incest, but that was the accusation. She was tried, convicted of adultery and incest, and sent to the Tower for execution. Jane Seymour said, I'll sleep with you now. Well, Anne asked to be beheaded in the French manner with a sword. That's why the sword on the stool is in front of her. And this was granted her. You sat on a stool, you had your head very high, you sat up straight. Her long black hair was bound up so it wouldn't enfoul the blade. And the swordsman over from France took the head right off. Virtually the next day, Henry married Jane Seymour, who was quite pregnant. At the end of that year, early 37, Jane Seymour, Queen Jane, gave birth to her child, a son, who lived. Henry named the boy Edward after Edward the Confessor and was so delighted he could hardly breathe. He danced the baby around and took him hunting and everything. He was totally transfixed on this little boy. Somebody was tugging at his sleeve. What is it? The Queen, Your Majesty. Well, what about her? She is dead. Yes, Queen Jane had died of puerperal fever within hours of the birth of Edward. Well, before Henry VIII could do one more damn fool thing with marrying the wrong person, Thomas Cromwell stepped in and said, we have got to get you into a state marriage to make a Protestant union. So you must marry one of these German princesses. All the German states were turning Protestant. And it would be a great alliance against the papacy, which was now the big issue, for Henry to marry into that line. So he said, all right, well, whatever. Bring a catalog. Eeny, meeny, ma, take that one. And he settled on the Princess of Clèves, Anna von Clèves, and they'd never seen each other, so portraits were exchanged. Well, all right. So Anne of Cleves, you call her. She came over to England after a proxy marriage, and they took one look at each other and screamed and ran out the opposite end of the room. This was not their idea of a happy union. And they both wanted out of it. Anne of Cleves was given a choice. She could go back to Germany, which was embarrassing to be a rejected bride, or she could stay in England with a pension. And she chose to stay, and she lived out the rest of her life quietly in England. Well, that all be done, Henry now turned on Thomas Cromwell. He said, you got me into this. Well, that's true in a way. Of course, all of Cromwell's enemies came to Henry and said, you know, yes, he's been dipping in the exchequer and he's been committing all this stuff, rumor. And Henry believed all that. So because he was so furious and embarrassed by his own stupidity, that he ordered a trial of Thomas Cromwell, who was then executed for treason. He was totally ruthless. During this episode, his eye had been caught by the handsome Catherine Howard. The Howard clan, very powerful Catholics. They're still in evidence today, and I believe they're still Roman Catholic. She was a magnificent specimen. He couldn't live without her, so he married her. No sooner had they settled out of the marriage bed, but somebody said, well, you know, Your Majesty, she is committing adultery. What? And yes, investigation proved that Catherine Howard had been sleeping around before and after the marriage. So she went to trial for the same thing that Anne Boleyn went, and off went her head. Catherine and Anne were the only two that Henry executed. I mean, out of 6, that's not a bad. Speaking of 6, Henry was gaining a lot of weight, and he was suffering arthritic problems. He probably would have been diabetic, but he was developing what might be phlebitis. His legs were very painful for him, had terrible bouts, and he was uncomfortable. He was prematurely aging. There was a woman at court. She was close to the center of things. She was a widow, well married and widowed, high position, not unattractive, not a youngster either, but she and the king had occasion to become acquainted, and he found her comforting. She said things that eased his unpleasant life. And as time passed, he decided he wanted to make her a permanent part of his life, and so he married her. She was Catherine Parr. Now, Catherine Parr stayed with him through the end. She was more of a caretaker and nurse than she was a Playboy bunny, but that was what Henry needed. It's what most of us need at a certain age. Sorry, girls. In the early 40s, about this same time that he married Parr, he proposed his baby son Edward in marriage to James V of Scotland's daughter, who was also Mary, and you know her as Mary Stuart. She was an infant, both these little tots. And that's the way marriages were arranged between the royals. You got busy early. But James rejected this. Now Henry said, this is because your damned wife, Mary of Guise, is doing it. Mary of Guise was Mary Stuart's mother. She was a very high-born French princess, very well connected to the French court. And there were French troops in Scotland to keep the peace for James V with Mary of Guise. And so Henry blamed the French. And he enlisted Charles V, the emperor, in a revenge attack on France. England and Spain were attacking France because of the thing that I just said. Well, it didn't work out too well. It wasn't a disaster for everybody, but it was unnecessary. Revenge is the problem. His last years were full of physical pain and political frustrations. He had earlier on in the 30s confiscated the monastery system of the Roman Catholic Church in England. This brought huge wealth to the crown. And Henry used this to buy peerages for his selected friends, loading up the House of Lords with pro-Tudor lords, and the same with the House of Commons. He was seeing to it that men were elected to the House of Commons who were supportive of his policies. We had nothing new to you, I'm sure. But the House of Commons was very compliant, is my point, as far as Henry's concerned. Henry justified all of his actions as being an act of patriotism. Golly, that sounds familiar. Where have I heard that one before? Well, in 1547, at the early age of 56, hugely overweight and very uncomfortable, Henry VIII died. His wife, Catherine Parr, by the way, went on to remarry, I think maybe twice after that. And her granddaughter would be Jane Grey, so don't forget that one. Henry's son, Edward, was 10 years old, and he was now, by active succession, to become Edward VI. Young Edward was immediately in the toils of the Somerset brothers, the Earl and Duke of Somerset. They were what we call today rather liberal Protestants. In other words, they tolerated people who were not Protestants. But they were ousted in the middle of Edward's reign by the Duke of Northumberland and his gang. Northumberland was a militant Protestant. He went after anybody that wasn't almost Calvinistic with a hammer, and he persecuted everybody that didn't conform to his idea of Protestantism. And he completely controlled Edward from the rest of Edward's life. Edward, by the time he was 12, 13, 14, he was adopting this same attitude. A youngster, you know, but he was being educated to be a fanatical Protestant. By 1552, it was evident that Edward was dying. He started out robust, but he faded. And we believe he was dying of bone tuberculosis. But whatever the case, Northumberland induced him, before he died, to name his daughter-in-law, Jane Grey, as heir to Edward's throne. Well, Edward died in 1553. He was only 16. Northumberland immediately rose in the House of Lords and proclaimed Jane Grey the Queen. But that wasn't the way Parliament or Lords understood the Act of Settlement. Henry had very specifically laid this out in his will. Edward marry Elizabeth. Well, the supporters of Mary, known as Mary Tudor, brought Mary, who'd been under house arrest under the Northumberland's regime, brought her into London. And of course the Londoners supported her, proclaiming him Queen Mary the First. And of course the crowds were so big that Jane Grey and her father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland, were overwhelmed, taken captive, and put in the Tower of London. Mary was proclaimed Queen as an act of Parliament now, and 9 days later, Jane Grey and her father-in-law were executed. Poor Jane, I always feel sorry for her. She didn't have a damn thing to do with this or to say about it. These loathsome male relatives did it all to her, so have some compassion. Mary Tudor was the first female ruler in English modern history. She was 37 years old. She was small, or slight, red-haired. She took her father's coloring, freckly, red hair, complexion, pale skin. She felt concerned about her existence. She had a terrible life. The minute her mother, Catherine, had fallen from grace, she had been declared illegitimate. I told you this. And no sooner than that, when Elizabeth was born to Henry's second wife, Mary was forced to be her lady-in-waiting. Here she was, a teenager, and she had to serve this baby stepsister of hers. And of course she resented that. But she never would abjure her Catholicism. Mary Tudor remained a devout Catholic all her life. Nothing could shake it. Well, she lived in some anxiety during Edward's reign, but it was worse under Northumberland. He placed her under house arrest and threatened her with execution. As Queen, Mary said, "It's my goal to restore the church to England, the one true mother church." And she set about doing this. She had suspected her stepsister Elizabeth of treason, and that was a difficult arrangement I'll get into in a minute. The Pope's authority, a year later, it only took her a year, the Pope's authority was being reestablished. The churches in England were being cleansed of their Protestant ministers, and Catholic priests were being brought in to take over. The heresy laws were revived, and anybody who wasn't a Roman Catholic was being persecuted. Unfortunately, rebellions resulted, religious ones, and Mary purged them harshly, and she got the sobriquet for doing it as Bloody Mary because of the persecutions. Now, she was no bloodier than who went before or who came after, I have to tell you that, but you guess that. Then the second thing she did was announce her marriage to the Infant of Spain, the prince who would be Prince of Wales in England, the reigning prince, Philip. Charles was his father, and Philip would be King of Spain one day. Well, when she did this, there was a vast rebellion in Kent, the Kentish areas to the west, northwest of London. They rose in rebellion. Their leader was Tom Wyatt, and they marched on London. We were not going to have a Spanish king consort, or whatever he would be called, or a Spanish heir, which of course would be the result. They call it Spanish. And the rebellion was big. But Mary went down before her officers. They had, of course, London was all up in arms. And she gave a very dynamic speech, got them all excited, and they rushed out to meet the Wyatt rebellion. And of course, they won the day. Wyatt was captured and, of course, hanged for his efforts, along with a great many other people. That meant that Mary's side was still winning, if you will. And she took sides with Spain in a Franco-Spanish war. See, England was still busy muddling up the big elements in Europe. And as a result of this short war, England lost Calais, her last foothold in Europe. And poor Mary's reign is always stigmatized for having done this. The English always claim that was hers. She announced in 1555, I think it was, that she married Prince Philip, by the way. Did I say that? She announced her marriage, and she did marry him. He came over to England, and she announced she was pregnant. And so Philip stood around until the results were in. Oh, he and his courtiers were very arrogant. They thought the English were all trash, but it was a good pied-à-terre for the Spanish to have England. Well, her pregnancy the next year, but the next year, was proven to be a false one. There would be no child. So Philip took his courtiers and went back to Spain. Never saw Mary again, had the marriage annulled. Well, Mary was terribly upset by this and depressed. She was demoralized by all these rebellions, and the whole thing was very ugly. Her relationship with her stepsister, Elizabeth, had been very difficult. She was going to have Elizabeth executed. Elizabeth then made nice. I'll tell you about that in a minute. And Mary accepted her. There wasn't any execution, but it was an ugly thing until it was over. And it was over the next year, 58, when at the age of 42, Mary Tudor contracted flu and died. So we still have these problems, don't we? That brought Elizabeth in the line of succession. Elizabeth I, another female ruler. All the men were jangling their codpieces in anguish. She was 25. Well, she too was tiny. Remember, she was Nan Boleyn's daughter, and Nan Boleyn was minute. She was a redhead too. All the children took their father's coloring, not his physique. Well, she'd been on good terms with her half-brother Edward. That hadn't been too bad. But the Earl of Somerset had been her guardian, and the fact that she was a 13-year-old and he was a grown man led itself to some rumors that were not too flattering, but we don't know for sure about any of that. Whatever the case, it didn't go too badly for her then. But the Northumberland thing was another horror for her, of course. This was very difficult. By the time her stepsister Mary came onto the throne, of course, Elizabeth expected to be involved in the Wyatt Rebellion against Mary. And so she was taken to the Tower to be executed, trial or no, by Mary. And of course, as these days progressed through this incident, Elizabeth realized what was happening and immediately contracted with a priest, a Roman Catholic priest, to teach her the catechism, and then had herself rebaptized. Now, she'd been baptized a Catholic as a baby. Nan Boleyn was a Catholic. We were all Catholics then. Nobody heard anything else. But she had herself rechristened and worked on her catechism and then converted with the priest and all the rest of it. And then she went to Mary when they had their few interviews and said, "I'm as Catholic as you are. And I've never fought against you or tried to do anything against you or oppose you." Well, she was apparently convincing enough. Mary was so suspicious, paranoid, but she forgave Elizabeth and let her go live. So Elizabeth survived that incident. Well, as queen, Parliament wanted to get her married. They wanted a strong man right there beside her to take care of this weak vessel called female. You know how that goes, girls. You're all weak, aren't you? Weak and feeble. You are, right? You know. But she said, "Yes, all I want is to be married and have lots of children. Bring on the suitors." Along they came. Parliament and the nobility had all manner of lists of people. Even Catherine de' Medici's son came over with his humpback and his hair lip. But he was sort of fun. And they all wooed the daylights out of Elizabeth, and she enjoyed it. She had a good time being wooed. That's the best part of any relationship, right? Yes. Absolutely. The rest of it's a nightmare. But she had a great time. But she always managed to charmingly and graciously tell her ministers, "Did you notice the great big pimple on his nose? Do you think this indicates syphilis in the family?" Oh my God, really? Oh dear. Well, he's off the list. Next. And she did this with all of them. And of course, she remains the Virgin Queen. Well, at least in name. And she spent 40 years being the Virgin Queen. It was terrific. By the 1560s, the Anglican Church, as we call it today, began to take its modern form. Elizabeth was a reasonably moderate reformer in regard to people who didn't conform to the Anglican Church. In other words, if there were some Catholics and some radical Protestants, this didn't drive her crazy to make them conform. And this, of course, a lot of people didn't like this. The Puritans, for instance, they thought, no, she should make them all conform. The worst thing that happened to Elizabeth started back in 1561 with the arrival in Scotland of Mary Stuart. Mary Stuart's claim on the English throne was just as good as Elizabeth's. How will this work its way out? We'll see after the intermission.